Hi everyone, my name is Mike Henry, and this is my Procreate 4.3 demo for the piece I call Tamira's Next Move. But before we get into that, I want to thank you. This channel, by the time this video releases, I believe has hit 40,000 subscribers. That's crazy. When I started this whole thing, I really just kind of did it as a fun side thing, and I didn't think it was going to end up being anything. The fact that theoretically 40,000 people see these every time I drop a video is just mind-boggling to me. So thanks for coming to the channel and viewing everything and giving me all your support over the years. Also, if you watch these videos, but maybe you don't subscribe or sometimes you forget to hit like if you like them, please consider hitting subscribe. It actually helps a lot. It sort of lets the YouTube machine know what people like to see. So if it doesn't hurt you too badly, please throw me a subscribe, like a video if you enjoy it, and that'll really help the channel grow. So thanks again. Now let's get into the video. I'm still playing a bit of catch up. My Instagram account is already way ahead of YouTube, so sorry, thank you for your patience trying to get everything caught up. Timing just hasn't been great. What you're looking at here is a pan through of a sketch I did a couple months ago at an offsite at work. You know, as artists, we tend to listen better and process information better while we're sort of doodling and listening to things. So that's what I was doing here. And that generated this sheet of just rando heads. There were some heads here that I liked, but this one in particular caught my eye as something that I would want to do something with. You can even see I've got the gradient in the hair sketched in because that's just something that I thought would work out nicely. And that's what takes us to the piece we're going to look at today. Now this is just a head. We need to give a little bit more, at least for the purposes of where I wanted to take the illustration. So we put it into Procreate and start sketching out the body, just trying to continue what was going on already in the head. Her attitude is pretty clearly communicated, so I wanted to get like a posture that sort of fit that. So we've got hips a little bit forward, arms just at her sides, and at one point I kind of throw a little hand like she's got her thumb in her waistband, but then I decided, you know what, no, because she seems like she's actually more just standing there staring at something. The reason why this is called Tamira's Next Move, when I posted this on Instagram, I posted it with a little, like the little, I don't know, blurb about somebody making a rude comment about her fanny pack, and she was contemplating her next move. So that's what this is. Now, we've taken it from a landscape image and imported the lines into portrait. I just wanted to highlight the character more and get her bigger on the page. So that's why we brought it into portrait. You can see me working on the background first. I just thought this would be cool. It's kind of like a old throwbacky look, and I thought that that would pair well with her as a character. I just thought it could be fun. Also, you'll notice in the sketch, she's got a bunch of scribblies going down her like neck and arm. I originally wanted to pack her with tattoos, which I still think would be kind of cool. But then once I started putting the flats in, which is what is the process you're seeing right now, I decided that was too much, and I decided to back off and just kind of let the character be everything that's already there on the character and just have that kind of be her. Putting in the tattoos would maybe be too much. So that's where we end up going with just the look of Tamira as a whole. So right now we're flatting in her face as a separate piece, which is what I do quite often. It's mostly so that I can maintain where the ear edge and the jaw edge is, and then I can make it just a little bit more controllable when I'm doing the shadows there, because that's something that I really like to push, is pushing that face forward and just the dimension of that whole thing. And now we're going to work on her body. Now, I could break out that arm and have it be a separate flat. In fact, in an illustration that you guys are going to see later, I do just that. The problem is sometimes then it's hard to get the blends right when the arm meets the body. So instead, what I decided to do here is have the shirt be the top layer of her skin, which is normal, or not the top layer of her skin, but the layer on top of her skin, which is totally normal. But since we've got this arm here, we have to take that into account as well. So it's fine. I mean, most of the time you try to establish your layers in a way where the thing that's closest to us is the topmost layer, and the thing that's just because it's easy for the mind to kind of understand that. But occasionally you have to do some nonsense in order to get around some elements of your illustration. So here we've got the shirt on top, and so the shirt is on top of the skin, but of course in space it's actually on top of her body and under her arm. So we have to just keep that in mind when we're going through the image. That can be somewhat complex when we get to the shadow pass, because as you know, with the methods that I've been using for the last bunch of time, we have these like unified shadow layers on top. And by doing that, there's two things that we have to keep in mind. We have to keep in mind the consistency of the shadow. So like for instance, her arm is going to cast a shadow onto her shirt and onto her stomach, torso, hip kind of area there. And we need to make sure that that is consistent. Also, when we're painting in the shadow layers, in order to keep things clean, we have to keep the arm and the body as separate entities. So it's sort of the opposite problems. It's like we have to keep them consistent, but then we also have to keep pieces separate. Right now, you're going to see the flats go in actually pretty close to the colors that they all end up. There is some tweaking that happens later, because not only is there tweaking just from the standpoint of preference and starting to get everything to work together, but then once all your shadow layers and lighting layers start going on, sometimes certain colors don't work as well as you wanted them to. Or maybe something where you're dealing with two colors that in the flats look totally different, and then once all the other crap gets thrown on top of them, they start looking too close. And if you want your color blocking to read clearly, maybe you decide that you want to sort of separate all that. So we don't necessarily have a major problem with either of those here, but there is some tweaks. Like I start with her fanny pack being orange, and then it ends up more of like a purpley pinky desaturated kind of color. So there's some simplism in this piece, in the fact that it's just a character that is standing there in profile, and there are things about that that are simple. I try to find some opportunities for challenge within that though, whether it's trying to communicate a material right or doing something different with lighting. And you know, I just am in general, I think I've mentioned this before, I'm a fan of a more like stoic, almost like contemplative pose than an action pose. Drawing an action pose to me is actually kind of boring. It kind of feels like I'm overdoing it. I love it when other people do it, but when I go to do it, I'm just like, ugh, another ridiculous action pose. And I know that the counter argument would be like, another boring character just standing there, but there's something about it that I just prefer. It's kind of, maybe it's because it reminds me more of like certain types of photography. I don't know. I really actually don't know. It's just something I've always preferred. Even when I think about some of the coolest characters that are like the most action-packed badass characters ever, I like still images of them better, like them being still. So that's where I get my desire to do like characters like this, just kind of standing there looking like they are just alone with their thoughts, I guess. Not in like a dramatic fine arts kind of way, just kind of in like a interesting looking character kind of way. I wasn't originally going to give her like a bright colored hair, but then it just kind of struck me as like that would be an awesome thing, because the rest of her is pretty I guess like standard. She's just got like a normal top on. She's got these like jean shorts. Like it's all pretty okay. She's got a fanny pack. And so it's like, what is going to be the thing that's going to be kind of eye-catching here? And I think while there are aspects of it that are eye-catching in their own like little quieter ways, I wanted something that was just like a little poppy. Now, the going with this like super saturated pink, which is very similar to the pink that I did in my art book, Pink Hair Girls, I was like, okay, I don't think that's right. If you look at her hair and her skin tone and her fanny pack and her just her colors overall are starting to all feel a little on the heavy side, and so I wanted to bring something in there to bring some more lightness to it. And so when we get to actually settling on the color for her hair, we go with like a more cotton candy bright color, which is a little different than what I normally do. I sort of prefer these like richer colors, but I wanted to bring like, I guess almost like some visual levity to the image. And so that's where we end up going in a second here. We're going to flip to like the brighter pink. There we go. So it sits in a little bit of like a pink purple, and then it's got this gradient mimicking my original ballpoint pen shading that I had done on it, and it'll get some more tweaks as time goes on. In fact, I even tried green at one point, seeing if making it the same color as the background is cool, which by the way it's not in this case. Blue I even try, which is kind of cool, but I still think that the pink that I settle on was the right way to go. It just works for the character really nicely. So these are some of the struggles that we're in before we get to the shading part. You saw green flip by for a second there and blue flip by now, and then it's going to go to the pink that we end up settling on. This slightly warm pink. I usually prefer a warmer pink than a cooler pink, but anyways, that's where we settle. So now that we're getting to the end of settling all of our flats, we're going to start doing the shadow process, or the shading process, or the lighting process, however you want to say it. You can also see that fanny pack now has changed a little bit more purple pink, and that's of course to key in with the hair so that we don't have too many crazy colors going on. You can totally balance tons of crazy colors. It's just, it felt nice to get it just a little reduced in this case. Now if you think back to my Girl in the Giant Robo Letterman's jacket, the lighting for that was like a light just put right on her, almost from our point of view, maybe a little bit top right, and I liked that a lot. I thought that was really fun to play with. So in this case we're going to do the same thing. At this point I'm putting in the ambient occlusion, and then when I get to the actual direct light part, it's going to be kind of right on her, straight from our point of view, but a little up and right, as opposed to say putting the light literally in physical space up and to the right of her, where we're having a downward light. We're going for more of a straight on light with a little bit of a downward bit to it. So right now we're doing the ambient occlusion. You can see it going in around her, on her jean shorts and other elements right there. The way the layers are, I believe her leg skin is far back, and then it goes to like jean shorts from there, and then like up and up and up, and you'll sort of see, you can either go back to how the flats got put in and maybe suss it out, or now as the shadow layer is starting to go in, you can see a little bit of what the layer order is. So I've explained this in the past. I'll explain it again just to be sure. When I'm usually referring to an AO pass on my paintings, first of all, that is an initialism for ambient occlusion. There are people out there that can teach you ambient occlusion far better than I can, and I encourage you to look that up. Also, I don't really do a true ambient occlusion pass, or at least I don't think I do. I think that I do something that's a little AO and a little what I would call like a form shadow, like something that's just sort of giving like diffuse information, not diffuse information, but like sort of the surface information of the geometry. And what I mean by that is, like, if her elbow has like that muscle that goes right around the elbow on the forearm there, I'll try to give that definition, but I'm not doing it in a way where I'm super processing ambient occlusion. There are areas where I do something I think that is much closer to ambient occlusion. Now, that was all kind of a messy explanation, but I think that the way that you can think about it in the simplest way is I'm going to be doing shadows that are about defining the form, and then I'm going to do another set of shadows that's about the direct light hitting her and casting shadows. So the way I'm doing this is I'm going in with my brush and I'm blotting in the shadow in a somewhat precise but also somewhat loose way, and then I'm using the smudge to get it pushed in exactly the way that I needed to. For this one, I'm using a light desaturated reddish brown, and that is on a multiply layer that is on top of everything. So my layer stack looks like one folder that contains all the flats as separate layers, and then on top of that another folder that's usually named something like lighting or depth or something, just something so I know what it is, and then in there is going to be a series of layers that end up giving dimension to the flats. What we're working on now is just a multiply layer that's in that color that I mentioned earlier, like a light desaturated red-brown, and I'm putting that in a soft way to try and communicate the areas where the light doesn't really get to. And that is the most basic way possible of describing ambient occlusion. So go look that up for someone who knows what they're doing. Now you can see here how I just had it painted over her arm, the shadow, and then I had to erase it away. That's the problem I was talking about before. Since her arm and her body are on the same layers, when I'm going in and putting that ambient occlusion on her stomach and side, it is going to be on the arm as well, because I'm on top of everything, and the arm is not a separate layer. So just having to be careful of that. And then when we get to the part where we're going to put shadow on the shirt, we then have to do the opposite, which is make sure that the shadow does carry over and is accurate, because the arm is then creating that shadow on her shirt. See something interesting here in a second. There's going to be a blotch that will appear to the right there, changes color a bunch, and then you see me continue painting. So that is when I'm in the middle of doing the shadows and I decide that I want to change their color. I have smudged these so much that trying to find an area where the color is 100% true is really hard to find. So what I do is I just, to the side, create just a little blotch of 100% true color, and then I will use the hue saturation sliders to change the shadow exactly to where I want, looking at the figure, looking at her in this case, and saying like, is this color better, is that color better? And then once I've decided which one is better, I'll convert that layer back from multiply to a normal layer. So now I've got just the pure color, and I'll resample now that new blotch, because that new blotch changed color with the shadows that are on the character. And then I can sample it again, turn it back to multiply, and then keep working. And I'll usually end up leaving that blotch there for a really long time, because if I end up changing that color again, I'll want to be able to just sample it without having to create it. And at some point when I decide that those colors are all where I want them to be, or at the very least they don't have to be where I want them to be, but I have to be done with that phase to where I'm not going to be resampling the color, I'll just delete it, and then I can adjust whatever I want after that. Now in a section like this where you see me turn off the shadows and then it kind of looks like it's hard to see what's going on there, that's usually me cleaning up a flat somewhere, because I've decided while I'm actually in the middle of working with it that there are things that need to change. could see I just did some local color changes there around her neck and her elbow, and now we're moving into face details. This is still with the ambient occlusion pass. You can see that I don't have much local color variation in the face yet. I had that on the hair just because that was already something that was kind of neutral. It was like a gradient. I didn't need to worry about the form. But the reason why I don't do anything with the face yet is because I still have to define that form. If I go in right now based on the sketch, which I'm going to try and stay close to, but if I go based on the sketch and I put in like face variations, skin variations, or like eyeshadow or lipstick or something like that, it could completely change during this phase right here, because I could end up deciding in the middle of it that something in the line work didn't really work. I had to define something differently, or maybe even something where I just screwed up and I'm not good enough to do something that I want to be able to do, and then I have to react to it and adjust. So I don't do any of that until the ambient occlusion pass is done, because that's what gives me my form that I can then put everything in with. Right now you see me laboring over the ear, because I always put a lot of work into the ears for some reason. I don't even have like a weird fetish, it just, for some reason I like ears to have detail. It's kind of weird. So you can see now her face, going from this sort of very stylized flat shape, is starting to get some more dimension. We've got a little bit of definition where the cheek is. We've got the lower lids defined, the area around her nose, some of the geometry there is now worked out, and now we're doing the upper lid, and so it's starting to bring her to life, her expression to life, because we're actually establishing what the geometry is that's only implied in the line art. I think for a lot of people, transitioning from maybe someone who does a lot of drawing all the time to then actually having to apply color that isn't just flat, whether you're doing it traditionally or doing it digitally, sometimes you have these little tricks, or these sometimes just symbols, but other times maybe it's a complete understanding of the anatomy, but you know you can represent it really well by drawing something a certain way, and then you go to actually do the coloring and you realize, oh, how does that actually work? And even someone like myself who does a lot of colored work, there are times where I'm coloring something that was done in 2D, that I did in 2D in a line drawing, and I'm like, oh shit, I don't actually know how this would work for real. And you either have to invent it because maybe it's something that is totally different stylistically, or you have to reference something. But in the end, the point is that you can encounter that pretty frequently, especially when doing really stylized things. So I think that's a challenge for a lot of people, is they're used to drawing something a certain way, and then when they transition into colors, you can see maybe the colors, the forms feel wrong now. You've been drawing them forever. In your mind, you're like, no, the nose is supposed to look that way though, because I drew it. I know how that nose looks, but if I color it based on the lines that I put in here, it's kind of a mess. And I think that the fun thing is when those start influencing each other, when the way that you draw influences the way that you paint, and then because that doesn't necessarily work out all the time, the way that you paint comes back and re-influences the way you draw, and that sort of thing happens over and over and over again. And that to me is actually really fun. It can be really frustrating when you're just like, I want to color this goddamn picture, but you know, art is messy like that. It's a challenge as well as a reward, and well, I mean, technically reward without challenge, is there really a reward? But like, really the point is that art is complicated, and when you decide that you want to take on a new artistic challenge, you can carry some of what you know over into that, and then you also have to figure out a lot more that you don't already know. And that leap, when you're going from drawing in 2D with lines to becoming someone who's painting, can be really daunting, but ultimately it's worth it. It's going to make you a better artist all around. It's going to influence everything, and it's going to be really great. So speaking of the local color changes, you can see that now that I have this structure for her face, I can actually put in the lips And you can see right there I just made an adjustment even, because once I put the lips in I realized that there was something wrong with the anatomy of her mouth, and I adjusted that just now. There's also eyeshadow, and then there's some skin variation that's going to come in too. You can see right there there's also the darkening of the upper lip. Technically I should capture that in some other part of the lighting, but this is one of those sort of more design oriented stylistic decisions to make that upper lip definitely read differently than the lower lip. You see me do this a lot across anything. Basically anyone who has a closed mouth, I make sure that I do that on. In fact, I'm working on a painting right now that this morning I did the sort of like upper lip darkening pass. So it's just a nice way of really establishing the lighting in the scene, even if it's a little artificial. You can see right there we just did a color shift. I wanted it to read a little bit differently, so I saturated her skin a little more. And now we've put a very subtle pattern on her jean shorts, and now I'm painting in the stitching for her jeans shorts. It's actually really hard to see, and then I darken it slightly, because if you can't see it, why is it in there? So I thought that I had the color more or less correct, but then right there you can see I darkened it so that you could see it a little bit better. Now we're adding in a bunch more detail. You can see we added in the button, and now we're adding in some more shadow around the leg to turn the form a little bit more. We also shaded around her butt to make that turn form a little bit better. There was a toggle you just saw, and that was sort of showing you what those changes were doing for the image overall. And then we're cleaning this up a bit so that it all isn't a mess, basically, because that was a little messy right there. Put a little bit more of that on the fanny pack. And now we pull out because we're also going to add a little bit more rounding of her arm so that we can get just a little bit more dimension out of that. Then we're going to do that also on her stomach and a little bit on her hair and her shirt and things like that. We're just trying to get some darkening around the edges so that we can get a little bit of that form turning happening, and really trying to sell the dimension of her as a character. So now here we're going to duplicate her body and fill it in with our shadow layer and then offset it, and that right there creates a shadow being cast in the background. I go around the edges and I smudge it out a bit and paint it a little bit just so that it's not perfectly one-to-one, so it's got a little bit of that handcrafted feel. And then we will actually use this shadow a bit as our reference point for the rest of the shadows across the piece. Here then I also duplicate the body again, and I will, with a black, I will then blur it slightly to To give a little bit of an AO going around her body in the shadow only though. I'll delete it away from everything else so that it's just creating a shadow where it's getting a little darker as it gets closer to her body. Now remember, with the lighting that we're going for here, she's theoretically pretty close to the wall that's next to her, and that's why she's casting that shadow. So the way it is, so that's what we're going with, is that she's that close to that shadow. So now we start laying in the shadow. The rules that I sort of set for myself here on this particular pass was that it was going to be cast shadows only. So that's why we kind of did that pass where we were rounding out her forms a little bit more. Now what we're doing is any part of her that would cast a shadow onto her is going to get that shadow. And it's a little bit of like an object to object rule where it's like, oh, the hair onto the skin or the jeans onto the fanny pack. But there are also some times where her shapes of the same flat, this is getting complicated, will cast a shadow on themselves. So for instance, the side of her body is the same flat as her arm, but her arm, as far as her actual anatomy goes, would absolutely cast a shadow onto her. So anyways, the point is that there's shadows being cast, and that's what I'm trying to focus on here, is the cast shadows, not shadows that define the shape of the thing, like as light hits the surface and then, you know, falls off around the shape. And I'm doing my best to try and keep track of the way the shadow is that she is casting onto the back wall, and using that as my guide for how the shadows will cast in general. Now, I'm not using reference for this simply because it's not based off reference. I didn't look up a chick that had a light shining on her to try and get this right. Reference in general is a really good thing to look at when you don't know what you're doing. However, there's also a certain amount of information that you have banked away in your head from practice. And so while I'm not saying that I am a master at figuring out lighting and the way shadows fall and all that kind of stuff, and I could theoretically take a picture of somebody with a light and try to get it right, and then I can mimic that, there's a certain amount of this that I want to be able to do without reference. That's not to say that I'm ignorant to reference. It's to say that, like, the amount of art that you have to crank out, especially in a professional environment where you're just having to simulate things like lighting or texture or whatever it is, like finding reference for all of that is a nightmare. And there's a certain amount of this information that you just have to know, and you have to be able to approximate it to a believable level. And that's really what I'm going for. It's not supposed to be photorealistic. It's supposed to be representative of something that makes sense, I guess you could say. And so that's where I'm going here. The lighting, I think, at least for the most part, feels the way that it should. It feels like there's a light shining on her and everything is casting a hard shadow, and that's what I'm using to determine success. Now, when you get into the minutia of the way that the shadows are landing, is it perfect? Probably not, but sometimes you don't have time for perfect. So now we're doing that intense edge on the shadow that's being cast. That's nothing fancy. It's just a bright red layer with its opacity way reduced. And now we're moving into the highlights. They're not the highest of highlights, they're more the lights, I guess you could say, which is like a turquoisey blue that has had its opacity lowered quite a bit, though it's not a special layer setting, it's just normal. Now we're getting into what I think is one of the more fun phases, which is reflections and bounces. So here you can see we're reflecting some of her own cheek skin onto her eyeball. We're also reflecting a little bit of the green onto her lips and other parts like her nose. What I decided to do in this one was treat the background as though it was physically behind her. Therefore, I'm capturing some of the bounce from that environment onto her. Sometimes I may consider the background almost as a abstract thing in concept, and it's not physically there, so I won't bother to have that bounce happen. However, here, that's what I wanted to go for. So you can see there's also a little bit of green bouncing under her chin slash jaw, under her neck, and her hair is bouncing off her skin. And so just going around and making sure that I'm taking into account every area and what might be reflective, and create anything from a true reflection to just like a bounce. You'll see a second ago I adjusted her butt. I thought it was slightly too big. With the curve of her as a character, it just felt like it was getting too far out in the sort of, I don't know, the structure. It just didn't feel right. So I brought that in a little bit and then added some extra details in the jeans for the wrinkling and all of that. The point where I decided I definitely didn't want to do the tattoo, but I decided I wanted to throw some sort of awesome 90s bangle type thing onto her arm. Also, this is cool because if you glance up at her face and some of her body and stuff here, you can see some of the local color now that was changed as the process went on, just to give her a more natural feel. That variation in skin is a really good way to sell the believability of like any character basically. And so when I'm doing any character, at some point the skin just goes on as flats, and then you revisit it later and you try to give it more character and make it, I mean, not real, but you're trying to key off of things that feels real. And the same thing is true with clothing. It's just that clothing doesn't usually vary that much. So something like jeans has some variation, which is why we put that texture in, but this shirt really wouldn't unless it had like a stain on it, and we're not trying to make that character look like a slob basically. So that's sort of why that is in there. Anytime that you put your flats in and then you start putting all your lighting in, it's always good to go back and revisit your flats and just make sure that there isn't more that you could be doing for those flats to give them something that's either unique or more realistic or whatever it is. Of course, that's when you're doing this type of painting. If you're doing some of the stuff I've done in the past where it's all color picked, you have to do that in kind of different ways. Some of it's the same, but then you also have to choose alternate routes. Every process has its pluses and its minuses. Right now, this process I think has a lot of pluses because with Procreate and the layer limits, it's a good way to get a good solid image and keep your layer count down. But you know, you have to evaluate your options every time you do something and try to figure out what the best way is to tackle it. The remainder of this video is going to be little tweaks, so I'm not going to talk for the rest of this here because it's just kind of a lot of really small stuff and it's not a lot to actually walk through, and I'll come back in at the end for the wrap up. Okay, and now you'll see some layer flicker here at the very end while I'm finalizing everything. And right here is the final image. Now you saw probably a little bit of like a tone shift at the very end, and that was because what I did was I merged everything into a new layer on top and then adjusted that layer and then reduced its opacity a little to try and find the right level between this sort of like newly adjusted layer and where it was, because usually I adjust it and it's a little too extreme. I put too much like color balance changes on it, and I want to bring it a little bit back to where it was. So that's what that was at the end. So let's take a look at the three major stages for this. We've got the sketch right here, which you can see got altered and cut just to fit exactly what I needed. And then we've got the flats stage right here, which is pretty definitionless, but you can see the core shapes and the core color blocking that we've got in the image. And then the final image here with all of the layers turned on and ready to go. And now the only question left is, what is Tamira's next move? What is she going to do about the insult? Anyways, thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed this one. This is actually one of my favorite pieces I've done in a long time. This one and the girl in the giant robocoat, I just really have been happy with how some of these have come out. So I hope you enjoyed watching the creation of them. I'll see you on the next video. And speaking of the next video, we take a little trip into the 80s. Totally Boss. And if you're looking for me on the internet, these are the places where you'll find me.